Greetings. We continue now with our Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra series, and we have arrived at verse 64, which constitutes the end of a section. And with the next verse, we'll begin a whole new section on bliss practices. So this verse 64 is an interesting one. Let me copy and paste it for you, for those of you watching live. Okay, verse 64 goes in the Sanskrit, vāyu-dvaya-saṃghaṭṭa antarva-bahirantataha yogī samatva-vijñāna-samudgamana-bhajanam, which means, and I'll paste my translation, due to the dynamic tension or fusion of the two prānas, either internally or externally, at the termination of the breath pause, the yogī, the practitioner, becomes a vessel for the arising of equality consciousness. Okay, so let's break this down carefully. The first thing we want to note is that it seems as if the practice being given here is no different or not significantly different from Yukti number 1, from the very first practice of the text. And if that's true, perhaps the author is inviting us to return to Yukti number 1, to come back to this home base, as it were, before we move on to these ananda or bliss practices in the next section. Or it could be that the practice is a little bit different here. The first thing that we notice if we're comparing it to Yukti 1 is that a different phala, a different fruit or result is described for sure, even if the practice is actually exactly the same. And that fruit is samatva vijñāna, the awareness or discernment or consciousness of samatva, equality. Right? You might be familiar with samasthiti or samakonasana in physical yoga. So the same word here, sama means equal or same, samatva, equality. Samatva vijñāna, awareness of equality, awareness that everything is equally an expression of the one divine consciousness. So that particular fruit of the practice was not mentioned previously, at least not explicitly. So some would argue just describing a different fruit or orienting us to a different fruit is already making it a different practice. I'm not sure, but it's something to contemplate. So anyway, as a result of this practice, the yogi, the practitioner, becomes a bhajana, a worthy vessel, or a, you might say, effective vessel. One becomes able to hold the arising samudgamana of equality consciousness, samatva vijñāna. Right? And perhaps it's significant that the word Vijñāna is in the title of the Tantra as well, or perhaps not. Okay, so through this practice, the yogi becomes able to hold the arising of this equality consciousness. So what's the practice? Well, what we have here is, and I'm looking at the commentary too, Shivopadhyāya's commentary makes it look as if it is definitely the same as Yukti number 1, because he says, oh, well, the antar, the inner point is the heart, and the external point is the Dvadashanta, or the Dvadashanta. And the terminus of the breath is the terminus of the inhale is the base of the heart. The terminus of the exhale is the space above the head, the Dvadashanta. So that's all the same. And again, the commentary spells it out. But then what we have different is this word, sanghaṭṭa. It's a quite difficult word to pronounce for a non-Sanskrit speaker. Sanghaṭṭa. And this is an interesting word because it can mean several things: collision, friction, dynamic tension, sexual intercourse. It can be used in a slightly more refined way, or slightly more vulgar way, one might say. Sometimes in colloquial vulgar speech, people refer to sexual intercourse as banging or bonking in the UK, and sanghaṭṭa does have that sense of kind of colliding together, but not only in a sexual sense, but in other contexts as well. But it is quite an intense word, to be honest. It's this sort of collision. Now, perhaps the word is not being used in that sense at all, right? I mean, it's certainly not being used in the sense of sexual intercourse, because we're talking here about the union of two prāṇa-vāyus, okay? But I meant to say, is the word being used in the sense of a kind of intense or violent collision? Maybe not. It could also mean simply fusion, or as I put it in the translation, dynamic tension. So really, the exact meaning of the word is uncertain. The commentator doesn't really help us there. So what we are sure about is that the grammar tells us because of this sanghaṭṭa, this fusion of the two prāṇa-vāyus. Now, the only two prāṇa-vāyus that could possibly be referring to is prana and apana, right? The energy of exhale and the energy of inhale. So we've now learned so far that these energies of prana and apana can fuse or come into this dynamic tension at this internal point at the base of the heart, or at this external point above the head. So for me, I mean, just in sort of real life practice, it's considerably easier to feel that dynamic tension at the base of the heart on the antar kumbhaka, on the inhale pause, right? When holding the breath at the end of the inhale. But I don't think that what's intended here is kumbhaka, is actually holding the breath, right? If we go with Swami Lakshmanju's commentary, what we are looking at here is this point in meditation where the breath becomes very, very, very subtle. Perhaps you've experienced this, where the inhale and the exhale become so tiny and subtle that the breath is barely moving, that it's just this tiny little inhale, tiny little exhale. And the breaths are very short and very subtle and very small. And this can happen very naturally in meditation with no, effort. And then what can happen is the breath suddenly pauses of its own accord, right? And this is specifically in this context in which the breath gets so small and subtle by itself. It's barely moving, and then all of a sudden, it's not moving. And according to some, such as Lakshmanju and others, this sanghaṭṭa is that moment where the breaths fuse. So if that is correct, then we're not at all talking about collision, the more intense meaning of this word. We're talking about a subtle fusion, sanghaṭṭa, as this moment where prana and apana naturally fuse. And if that moment takes place, energetically speaking, at the base of the heart or above the crown of the head, then you're going to have this unity consciousness or equality consciousness experience, where not only is everything God, everything is divine consciousness, but everything is equally divine consciousness in this experience. Even if that doesn't make any sense to the logical, rational mind, right? You know, which wants to see some things as more God than others, some things as better than others. In this experience, that's impossible. You can't see things that way. Some things better than others, even if it makes no sense. You actually see everything is equally expressing that one, that divine consciousness, even the stuff you don't like. I definitely have had this experience myself many times, and I hope you have too. But if you haven't, well, here's a practice, right? So if this interpretation is correct, then there's not much really to do in terms of this practice other than to sit and have equal length breaths and let the breaths naturally get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? They start out longer and deeper, and then they get very small, and then there's this kind of natural sublime pause moment. And then after that meditation, when it just feels natural to open your eyes, you may experience this equality consciousness. Okay? So I favor this interpretation, not because I specifically defer to Lakshmanju, as you guys probably know, but rather because then we have a different practice here, a subtly different practice that is more spontaneous, which makes sense given the fact that it's Yukti number 36, not Yukti number 1, even though it is very parallel to Yukti number 1. So perhaps it's a further kind of iteration and development of Yukti number 1 in the realm of spontaneous meditative experience. So this is one of those verses where there's some ambiguity, and that leaves some possibility for interpretation on the part of you, on the part of the practitioner. You know, what are you getting out of this verse? What are you understanding from this verse? How does it manifest in your practice? Right? Those are questions very much worth asking. In the comments window, somebody mentions that sanghaṭṭa can mean union. Well, yes, certainly. It's one of many words that can mean union, but that is, you know, the primary meaning, or the primary meanings were the ones I was giving before. Let's see if the dictionary tells us any other meaning that we should be aware of. Embracing. Well, I think that's actually a euphemism for intercourse in this dictionary. Yeah, that's it. We covered all the meanings. Okay, thank you guys. So that's it for this particular verse and this particular practice. It's relatively straightforward. How does it relate to the section that's about to come, the section on bliss practices? Well, maybe it's not a coincidence that the word sanghaṭṭa can mean this dynamic tension, this union, this intercourse even, right before we get some verses on bliss. Again, the verse is definitely not referring to sexual intercourse in any literal sense, right? But the intercourse, as it were, of these two prāṇa-vāyus, prana and apana, you know, meeting and merging in this space of perfect quietude. I hope you get to have that experience. Enjoy the practice of this verse, and for those who are watching live, we'll do another video right now on the first of the bliss practices. So please join me for that. See you soon. And I want to give a shout out, a thank you to all the patrons on Patreon. And I'm excited that we're actually at a new record high. I think it's the highest the Patreon page has ever been. 201 patrons whose generous support makes it possible for me to offer lots of free content. Not quite as much lately for those in the Facebook group because I've been traveling, but it will continue. So, including in just a minute. So thank you, patrons. We love you. We appreciate you so much. I do, and this whole community does, of the 6,000 people here in the Facebook group and the 2,000 people on the YouTube channel. That's the community that benefits from these teachings directly. So thank you. Om.